Elliot Monroe wasn't a man who needed much. It's a small cedar cabin tucked quietly into the edge of Maple Ridge Estates. Had everything he loved: a porch with a view of the morning mist, creaking floorboards that whispered stories from the past, and a fireplace that never failed to warm both the air and the soul. He had built it himself almost 15 years ago, long before the gated entry, the tennis courts, and the freshly painted stucco homes had arrived. On a Wednesday morning, the kind that arrived wrapped in fog and hummingbirds, Elliot stepped outside with a mug of black coffee and noticed a bright white envelope pinned under a smooth rock on his steps. He tilted his head. No postage. Hand-delivered, the logo on the upper corner said it all. Maple Ridge Property Council. He opened it slowly, careful not to tear the seal. Inside was a neatly typed letter on crisp letterhead. The tone was formal but direct. Oh dear. Mr. Monroe, following a recent inspection, it has been determined that your residential structure does not comply with the updated Architectural Harmony Guidelines established by the Maple Ridge Property Council to maintain visual and structural consistency across the community. Removal of the non-conforming structure is required within 48 hours of this notice. We appreciate your prompt attention to this matter. Respectfully, Maple Ridge Review Committee Elliot. Read it twice, then a third time. He folded the letter neatly, took another sip of his coffee, and sat down on the bench he had carved himself during the winter of 2013. For a moment, he didn't feel angry or confused. He simply felt still. His cabin had been standing since before Maple Ridge even existed as a neighborhood. When Elliot first bought the land, there had only been pine trees, deer trails, and silence. The community that eventually grew around his property had always felt like a welcome addition, not an intrusion. Until now. He looked around. Its front steps were freshly swept. The garden beds were trimmed and full of late summer bloom. The paint, while faded, gave the cabin its charm. There were no signs of disrepair. Nothing broken. Nothing out of place. And yet something had clearly changed. That afternoon, Elliot walked to the corner mailbox where the community bulletin board was posted. New rules and notices were pinned up in a precise, grid-like layout. One flyer caught his eye. Phase 3 Visual Harmony Initiative. All homes must comply by September 1st. Below the title was a list of design standards: earth tone, exterior paint, shingle roofing with minimal slope variance, and architecture consistent with modern colonial or coastal styles. He scanned the fine print. The rules had been updated just 3 weeks ago. A neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, stood beside him reading the same flyer. She leaned over slightly. "I think they're trying to make everything look like the model homes," she whispered. "But I like your place, has character." Elliot nodded. "Seems like character's not in the plan." She gave a small smile and walked away with her beagle, Lucy, trailing behind Dot by evening. Elliot had reread the letter 5 times and paced his living room more than he cared to count. He wasn't one to start trouble, but something about the way it was delivered, no knock, no conversation, no explanation, made him feel like a puzzle piece someone was trying to force out of the picture. He sat down at his old drafting table, once used for designing homes all across the county. Now it mostly held coffee stains and old blueprints. He pulled open a drawer and found a thick folder of land records, deeds, and maps, the kind of papers most people forget they have. If they had given him 48 hours, he thought, he might as well use every one of them wisely. Elliot rose early, the next morning, long before the sun had reached over the treetops. He stood at his kitchen window with a bowl of oatmeal and watched a squirrel dart across the railing. The notice from the Maple Ridge Property Council sat on the counter. It's white. Paper now slightly curled at the corners. He hadn't called anyone, not yet. Okay? He preferred to ask quiet questions first, ones that often led to better answers. After breakfast, Kay walked the path through the pine trees toward the community center where a small library and meeting rooms sat beside the tennis courts. Elliot hadn't been there in months, not since the annual chili cook-off, but he knew it would be a good place to listen. not to argue, to listen. As he entered the cool, quiet space, he spotted Tom Grayson, shelving books near the back wall. Tom was the kind of neighbor who knew everyone's middle name and what kind of bird feeders they used. He'd lived in Maple Ridge since the first row of homes had gone up. "Morning," Tom Elliott said casually, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. Tom turned, smiled, and gave a polite nod. "Elliott Monroe. Haven't seen you since the 4th of July pancake breakfast. Everything all right up your way?" Elliott shrugged. "Got a letter yesterday. They're asking me to remove the cabin." Tom paused mid-shelving. "You, seriously? Apparently it doesn't meet the visual harmony guidelines," Elliott said with a small smile. Tom scratched his chin. They've been making a lot of changes lately. New leadership, new design plans. Heard they're looking to refresh the whole look of the place? Elliott raised an eyebrow. "For what reason?" Tom lowered his voice. "Heard a few things, but it's mostly talk. Rumor has it the board's trying to partner with one of those private home investment firms. You know, the ones that like everything to look clean and polished. Might be thinking of selling off some of the community-owned properties, sprucing things up for valuation." Elliott let that sink in. That would explain the sudden push. Tom nodded. "It's been quiet, but yeah, your place is probably the last original structure standing. Everyone else either remodeled or moved years ago." Elliott thanked him and stepped outside, walking slowly past the tennis courts. Then along the row of rental townhomes on Cypress Row, they all looked freshly painted, matching in style, two-tone. Beige with shutters the same exact shade of navy. The landscaping was pristine. Not a petal out of place. He paused near the end of the row, where a small wooden utility shed sat behind the last townhome. The shed was nothing special, but Elliott remembered building it, not for himself, but for the association. Nearly a decade ago, back when they still asked his opinion on things, back when neighbors met on porches instead of video calls, he leaned against the fence for a moment, then pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket, a photocopy of the original land survey he'd pulled from his records the night before. The survey lines were clear. The townhomes and the shed sat squarely on a parcel labeled in bold. Private Parcel A, deeded to Elliott Monroe. He folded the paper back up and smiled thoughtfully. The land beneath the homes didn't belong to the board, it belonged to him. The old foreclosure auction years ago, he had purchased it thinking it was just a wooded buffer zone. Apparently it had become more useful than anyone realized. Elliott turned and walked home slowly, with no particular rush. He didn't need to argue with anyone. He didn't need to send letters or raise his voice. He just needed to decide how he wanted to respond. And he still had 36 hours left. The afternoon sun filtered through the pine trees as Elliott stepped back into his cabin, the door giving its familiar creak behind him. He set the folded land survey gently on the kitchen table beside the original demolition notice. The two pieces of paper couldn't have looked more different, one a tightly worded form letter, the other a precise map drawn in ink, stamped and notarized. But they both spoke volumes. Elliott brewed a fresh pot of coffee and carried, smug, to the drafting table tucked beneath the east-facing window. The same table where he had drawn blueprints for homes, additions, and cabins for nearly 4 decades. His hands still remembered the motions, even if the projects had grown fewer over the years. He opened the long filing drawer and pulled out a faded green folder marked Parcel A. Inside were more documents from the foreclosure auction years ago. Land titles, sale receipts, and property line declarations. Back then, the auction had been messy. A misfiled address, a rushed bid, and Elliott had ended up with a wedge of land that no one else seemed interested in. He had bought it mostly out of curiosity and caution, thinking it would keep any large developments from getting too close to his cabin. What he hadn't realized, until now, was that the community had quietly started building on it. Over the years, as the neighborhood grew, The townhomes on Cypress Row had slowly extended toward the parcel's boundary. Somewhere along the way, the structures crossed into Elliot's land. Not by much. Maybe just a few feet for some, a dozen, or more for others, but enough to matter. And now they were all sitting on land leased informally from him. A lease the HOA had inherited, but never properly renewed. Elliot had signed the original agreement nearly 10 years ago, offering the land for a symbolic amount. A handshake lease, the former board president had called it. That handshake, Elliot noted, had expired last spring. He leaned back in his chair and considered his options. He didn't want to cause trouble. He didn't like tension. But being told to demolish his cabin with no conversation, no warning, that wasn't how neighbors treated each other. At least, not the kind of neighbors Elliot believed in. He reached for a yellow legal pad and began writing a new letter. Direct, respectful, to the current Maple Ridge Property Council. I am writing to inform you that, as of April 1st of this year, the existing lease agreement for Parcel A has expired. This parcel includes the land currently occupied by the Eastern Townhome Row and Common Utility Shed. Moving forward, I am offering a renewed lease at fair market value which reflects the current demand and use of the property. Enclosed, please find a new lease proposal and supporting documentation of the original deed and property lines. I am happy to meet and discuss this in person at your earliest convenience. Respectfully, Elliot Monroe. He attached a copy of the survey and highlighted the encroachment lines, just to be thorough. Then he placed the letter into a manila envelope and set it by the door that evening. As the crickets began to hum, Elliot strolled down to the board office near the clubhouse and dropped the envelope into the secure drop box. He didn't linger. No dramatic gestures, no confrontation. Just a quiet delivery. By the time he returned home, the sun had dipped below the tree line. The porch light flickered on. Elliot sat in his rocking chair and listened to the night settle in. There was no anger in him, no bitterness. Just a sense of quiet purpose. They had given him 48 hours. He still had 28 left. By mid-morning the next day, Elliot's envelope had already made its way through the hands of the property council. It sat neatly on the table during their scheduled meeting, addressed in his careful handwriting, with the words Land Use Renewal Proposal underlined in blue ink. The board members, dressed in coordinated blazers and smart casual wear, skimmed a letter with puzzled expressions. Marissa Dunn, the current board chair, frowned slightly as she reread the second paragraph. This can't be right. He owns that parcel. James Bell, the community treasurer, tapped his pen against the edge of his notepad. It says he does. And the map looks official. There's even a county seal on the deed. Across the table, a younger member named Leela leaned forward. But those townhomes have been there for years. Some of them have backyard patios on that strip of land. James nodded. It's the point. They're technically leasing land. From him, and according to this, the lease expired in April. That means we're currently without legal coverage to use that property. Marissa sighed and folded the letter carefully. And he's offering a new lease at a market rate. Leela flipped through the attachments. It's 3 times the previous rate. Silence filled the room for a moment. Is he angry? Lila asked. No, James said thoughtfully. Not from the tone of the letter. It's calm, detailed. He even offered to meet in person. Marissa glanced out the window. This is about the demolition notice. James gave a small shrug. Can you blame him? Back at his cabin, Elliot was oiling the wooden trim around the windows. He didn't expect to hear back immediately. He'd worked with enough legal teams over the years to know that a formal response would take time. But he wasn't waiting idly. He'd spent the morning printing copies of all his land records, organizing them into folders by date. He wasn't planning to escalate anything, but he believed in being prepared. And more than that, he believed in communication, something he'd noticed had gone missing in recent board decisions. By noon, Elliot received a polite email from a board liaison named Rachel, asking if he would be available for a brief meeting the following morning at the clubhouse. The tone was warm and professional. He replied simply, Happy to meet. 9 a.m. works well. That evening, Elliot sat on the porch with his usual cup of tea. The sun filtered through the trees in golden streaks, the same way it always had. A pair of children zipped by on scooters down the nearby trail, laughing as they disappeared around the curve. He didn't feel like a man making threats. In truth, he hadn't even felt triumphant. What he felt was clarity, not just about his land, but about how easy it was for people to forget roots when things moved too fast. He looked out over his garden, now dotted with fireflies. His cabin stood quietly behind him, steady, honest. And still standing tall after 15 years. Inside, the lease proposal sat beside the fireplace. No demand, no dramatic language. Just a new agreement, a fair one, backed by records. And Respect. Elliot had played his card, but he'd done it gently. And as he watched the lights flicker across the yard, he knew the next move was theirs. The clock still ticked on the 40i tower notice, but by now, it wasn't the only one watching. Word travels fast in a quiet place. By the time Elliot arrived at the clubhouse the next morning, small but noticeable shift had already begun to ripple through Maple Ridge Estates. The air was unusually still for a Thursday. A few neighbors watered their flower beds with more curiosity than focus, glancing up as Elliot passed by. Others slowed their morning walks ever so slightly, as if hoping to catch a clue on his face. There wasn't panic, just interest, and a quiet understanding that something unusual was happening. Elliot arrived at the meeting 5 minutes early. The boardroom was modest but neatly arranged, with a long oak table, a pitcher of lemon water, and fresh notepads set out like a business. Luncheon, Marissa Dunn greeted him with a measured smile, followed by James Bell and Lila Chen. A fourth chair remained empty. Apparently, someone was running late. Mr. Monroe, Marissa began, thank you for coming. We appreciate how professionally you approach this. Course, Elliot said. I've always believed conversations go further than letters. James nodded. We reviewed your documents. Everything looks legitimate. It appears we overlooked the lease expiration during our last audit. That's on us. No hard feelings. Elliot replied calmly. I understand how things can get buried in paperwork. But now that it's come up, I think it's time we bring things back into balance. Lila spoke next. If I may ask, is your intention to keep the land long-term, or were you planning to sell? Elliot gave a small smile. At the moment, I have no plans to sell. It holds value to me, not just as a plot of land, but as part of what this place used to be. Marissa glanced at the proposal Elliot had brought. You're asking for a fair market lease, significantly higher than what was previously agreed to. That previous rate was symbolic, Elliot said. It was offered with trust. What I received in return this week didn't quite reflect that. No one argued. They didn't need to. The tone had already shifted. The urgency in their previous notice now seemed misplaced, even slightly embarrassing. James leaned forward. We'd like to propose a working solution, perhaps a revised lease at a modestly reduced rate, in exchange for certain long-term protections on both sides. Something that works for you and for the board. I'm open to that, Elliot replied. But we'll need a written agreement with defined renewal terms this time. No more assumptions. Outside the room, the conversation had already begun to spread across the neighborhood. Homeowners talked over fences, on porches, and through back gates. Some were surprised to learn that part of the land beneath the townhomes didn't belong to the association. Others were quietly amused that Elliot, the quiet man with the hand-carved bench and weathered hat, had so much leverage and had used it without raising his voice. I always liked that cabin, one neighbor said. Feels more real than the new stuff, another added dot, at the community park. A few families sat with coffee, chatting gently about what it meant for one person to hold ground, literally and figuratively, in a place that seemed to be speeding towards sameness. By the time Elliot walked out of the clubhouse, The board had agreed to review the revised lease terms within 48 hours. Not coincidentally, the same timeline they had originally given him to demolish his home. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The weight of what had happened was already settling in, not just on the boardroom table, but across the lawns and sidewalks of Maple Ridge. Some ripples moved quietly, but even the smallest ones can change the shape of a still pond. The weekend brought an unusual stillness to Maple Ridge, not the quiet of peace. Exactly, but the kind that hangs in the air. When people are waiting to see what happens next. Elliot noticed it as he made his usual Saturday morning walk around the edge of the neighborhood. Neighbors waved more often, some with curiosity, others with admiration. A few even stopped to ask polite questions. How long had he owned the land? Was it true about the lease? And Elliot answered kindly but briefly. Well, he wasn't looking to be the center of attention. He just wanted things made right. He passed the row of townhomes along Cypress Row, each one neat and matching, with small patios and manicured hedges. Nothing about them looked out of place. But now, Elliot couldn't help seeing them a little differently. Not as homes built beside his cabin, but on land that had quietly become his responsibility at the last unit. A woman stepped out from her screen door, holding a mug of tea. She was older, maybe in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back. In a bun. You're Elliot, right? She asked. Yes, ma'am. She smiled gently. I just wanted to say thank you. Elliot raised an eyebrow. For what? For not tearing the place down, she said, nodding toward the homes. Some folks were afraid you'd start evictions the moment you realized what you had. He chuckled softly. That's not how I do things. She nodded. Well, not everyone would have handled it the way you did. They talked for a few minutes more, mostly about the trees and the weather. She told him she had lived there since her husband passed, and how she loved the quiet of that end of the street. As he walked back, Elliot thought about her words. He hadn't considered how many lives were wrapped into those homes. It's not just buildings, but places where people cooked breakfast, raised kids, healed from loss. His letter may have made a statement, but it had also reminded him of something deeper. Land might be owned, but people lived on it. And that meant choices carried weight. Back at the cabin, Elliot reviewed a revised version of the lease the board had sent over late Friday. It was more balanced now. Reasonable rates, clear terms, a few added protections for both parties. They had also included a note expressing their hope that the agreement could set a positive example for collaboration. Moving forward, Elliot smiled at the phrasing. Carefully written, but progress. He made a few minor adjustments, one clause clarifying utility easements, another ensuring that no permanent structures could be expanded further without a written amendment, and sent it back with a polite note. By Monday morning, the signed lease was official. The demolition notice, quietly retracted with a formal apology from the board. A new letter arrived, this one far more thoughtful in tone, expressing regret for the misunderstanding and respect for long-standing contributions to the neighborhood. It wasn't dramatic. There was no public announcement, no speeches. But people noticed at the dog park, folks began wondering aloud if other rules might be more flexible than they'd assumed. At the community garden, someone posted a flyer proposing a neighbor's history night, inviting residents to share how and when they came to Maple Ridge, and at least one homeowner pulled up their application to paint their shutters purple and asked half-jokingly, "Do we really have to match?" Okay. Elliot didn't say much, but he listened. And in that listening, something quiet began to return, a feeling the neighborhood had once known. Long before committees and color swatches, a sense of place. The following week passed without incident, at least on the surface. The board kept a low profile, releasing no statements and skipping their usual weekly reminder email about community guidelines. It was as if everyone, in their own way, was still processing the shift. Elliot kept to his rhythm. He tended to his garden, trimmed the overgrown laurel hedge behind the shed, and roiled the porch steps. No one said anything more about the cabin. The demolition deadline had come and gone. silently erased from everyone's minds. But not from their memories. It had taken only one letter and one overlooked document to remind the neighborhood that not everything can be filed away or painted over. One morning, Elliot received a folded note left inside his mailbox. No stamp, no envelope, just his name written in blue ink. Inside the note read, "I used to pass your cabin every day and wonder how it was still standing. Now, I know it didn't need to match. It just needed to belong." It wasn't signed. He read it twice, then tucked it inside the back of his ledger. The kind of thing worth holding on to. Even if you never found out who wrote it, later that day, Elliot was invited to a casual lunch at the community center. Not from the board, this time from a group of longtime residents who wanted to talk less formally, more neighbor to neighbor. He accepted Dot at the potluck-style gathering. Someone brought homemade cornbread. Another brought peach cobbler, and a small crowd gathered around Elliot like he was an old captain who'd just navigated a quiet storm. No grand speeches, just questions, stories, and shared observations. A man named Ron, who had served on the board years ago, leaned back in his chair and asked, "Do you think we've gotten too organized for our own good?" Elliot considered the question before answering. "I don't think the problem is organization. It's when rules become more important than the people they're meant to serve." Heads nodded. A woman from Birch Lane chimed in. "I miss the days when you could paint your fence a little crooked and no one panicked." "I miss when people knew who lived 3 doors down," someone else added. They talked for over an hour, the conversation slowly shifting from frustration to something more hopeful. Ideas about neighborhood garden days, porch visits, maybe even a small welcome committee for new residents. Nothing official. It's just simple gestures to rebuild the thread between houses. Later that evening, Elliot sat on his porch, listening to the wind brush through the trees. His rocking chair creaked gently under him. A group of kids ran by chasing a frisbee, cutting across the trail like they always had. He didn't stop them. He liked the sound of their laughter a few yards away. The cabin stood just as it always had. Cedar planks, tin roof, flower boxes in bloom. Not modern, not uniform, but honest. It hadn't changed in any big way, and maybe that was the point. In a neighborhood that kept trying to polish away the rough edges, Elliot's cabin had reminded everyone that not all beauty fits a blueprint. As the sun lowered, casting long shadows across the pines, Elliot knew the ripples would keep spreading. Not because of anything loud he had done, but because of the quiet way he had stood his ground. Sometimes it only takes one home to remind the others what it means to stay rooted. In the weeks that followed, something subtle but unmistakable began to change in Maple Ridge Estates. The quiet tension that had hung in the air since Elliot's letter slowly dissolved, replaced by a sense of renewed connection and understanding. The property council, now more mindful of communication and transparency, held a community meeting to discuss the updated lease and the neighborhood's future. Instead of the usual formal atmosphere, the room buzzed with energy. Neighbors, swapping stories, asking questions, and even laughing together. It felt less like a meeting and more like a gathering of friends who had been reminded of what mattered. Elliot listened from the back of the room, his presence unassuming but steady. He didn't need to speak much. His actions had already spoken volumes. One of the board members stood and said, "This experience taught us that rules and agreements aren't just paperwork. They're about respect for land, for homes, and most importantly, for the people who live here." A woman near the front raised her hand and said, "And it reminded us why this neighborhood felt like home before all the restrictions." After the meeting, neighbors lingered, chatting under the string lights hung above the clubhouse patio. Invitations were exchanged for backyard barbecues, gardening tips, and shared carpools. The lines that had seemed so rigid began to blur, softened by understanding. Elliot returned to his cabin, feeling a quiet satisfaction. He sat on the porch steps and looked out over the land that had caused so much stir. The trees whispered in the evening breeze, the scent of pine mingling with fading sunlight. He thought about what had happened, how a simple act of standing firm, not with anger or threat, but with clear purpose and patience, had shifted the course of his community. The cabin, once threatened, was now a symbol. Not just of resilience, but of the idea that ownership carries responsibility. That roots run deeper than rules. Elliot smiled to himself. Creak of the rocking chair beneath him, a gentle echo of the neighborhood's heartbeat. As night fell, stars came out one by one, twinkling like promises whispered into the dark. And in the stillness, Elliot knew the true foundation of any home wasn't just wood or stone. It was the respect and care woven through every shared moment.